Good afternoon, students. So we now come to the 11th lecture, and just to give a brief recap over the last lecture, I had discussed with you issues regarding authorship and and what kind of disputes or misconducts which can happen with regard to authorship issues. And so I hope everyone has understood what I was trying to say the last class. And if any one of you have any doubts over the last lecture, you can still ask any questions in the next 10 to 15 seconds. You can unmute yourself and ask a question. Okay, fine. So let's proceed with the talk today. So just to give a very brief recap of the earlier lecture, I had talked about mainly authorship issues and what defines an authorship and things like that. And when can one get into trouble or get into disputes regarding authorships? So I had told you that there are two types of disagreements possible with authors lists. The first type is actually concerning those authors who actually do not contravene this ICMJE guidelines. That means they qualify as authors in their publications. So any problems concerning such people are termed as disputes rather than misconducts. But if it so happens that the authors contravene the guidelines, the four properties which an author should have as per the ICMJE guidelines, then the category falls into an authorship misconduct. And I had given you an idea about what kind of misconducts can happen with regard to authorship issues. So, as far as the first problem is concerned, that is authorship disputes, whether it is a need is there to see whether the person's contribution was substantial. So there could be some problem with that. And then usually the problems come with the order of the author list and to decide who should be the first author and or the corresponding author. The misconducts usually they happen when you have an unethical authorship list. That means sometimes you might have a ghost author, okay, or a guest author, or a gift author, or an orphan author, or a forged author. The most serious misconduct would be an unwillingness to take responsibility for a mistake or something which has happened with regard to the manuscript, and then try to pass on the accountability to others in the author list. So this is a rather a bad thing to happen, and one should not try to get into those kind of issues at all. Okay, so in these situations, what can the journals do? I had told that usually the editors of these journals, they are fairly highly qualified people, scientists themselves, with a lot of experience in dealing with manuscripts. And so the moment these people, they have a look at your manuscript, they know somehow that, look, if there is some problem, they can sense that there could be some issue with the manuscript or the authors and author list and things like that. How do they sense these things? There are certain pointers which help them actually. Like I had told you that you can have what is called as the cover letter, the covering letter which accompanies the manuscript. If the language given in the covering letter differs from that of the manuscript, it's a straight away, it's a giveaway saying that, look, this is a different person who's actually dealing with this. Then sometimes you find that when the referee comments are sent back to the authors, the corresponding author who is supposed to do all the correspondence, he is unable to correspond or respond to the reviewers' comments. So that means there is some issue there. So likewise, there are many other pointers which I had already discussed, and I had also discussed this the question of prolific authors. Then sometimes the authorship changes without notification during the revision stages. Then acknowledgements, for example. Okay, there's when an acknowledgement, this is the case of the prolific authors. There are some authors who manage to publish a paper every 5 days, which is rather unnatural. Okay, and so the case of acknowledgement, usually an acknowledgement looks like this. You say that the work has been supported by some grant, by some foundation or an agency, and then authors may like to thank some people for some specific purpose, either for some discussions or for some help during experiments or some kind of inputs like that. So you cannot simply leave it hanging. You cannot write a statement saying authors would like to thank Mr. A, Mr. B, Mr. C. You have to give a reason why you are thanking. If you do not give a reason why you are thanking, then that also gives rise to some suspicion why you are acknowledging a particular person without giving him any role on why he should be reason why he should be acknowledged. So that's one pointer. So like that, I mean, there are several such pointers which potential signs where the editors can sense that there could be some problems with the authorship. So what should be the journals be doing under such circumstances? Firstly, what the journal should do is that they should set very stringent standards for authorships. Okay. What do you mean by that? I had already discussed with you the ICMJE criteria for being an author. But now these have been substantially modified, and what is now more popular is what is called the MACNETS criteria. So here, it is the same, it's a follow-up on the ICMJE guidelines, and it's more detailed. So here it's more specific. It states that the author is expected to have made substantial contributions to the conception or design of the work, or the acquisition, data acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of data, or should have drafted the work or substantively revised it. And so these are all a set of ORs. Then there's also an AND condition. And to have approved the submitted version and any substantially modified version that involves the author's contribution, and to have agreed both to be personally accountable for the author's own contributions and to ensure that questions related to the accuracy and or integrity of any part of the work, even those parts in which the author was not personally involved, they are appropriately investigated, resolved, and the resolution documented in the literature. Then the journals must provide proper expectations for the corresponding authors. So here, when you submit a manuscript, the corresponding author becomes the key man between the manuscript and the journal. Okay. So the corresponding authors, they have a very important role to play. They must ensure that all the listed authors actually have approved the manuscript before the submission itself. And all authors receive the submission and all substantive correspondence with editors, as well as the full reviews. Nowadays, of course, this is automatically ensured by the journal itself, because once the manuscript is submitted to the journal sends emails to all the authors involved, checking with them whether they are a part of the work, and if they are not, why, and they should state it. And also they send the referee reports as and when they come to all the authors, not just to the corresponding author. Of course, the corresponding author will have the right to frame send the reply, okay, after discussing with the other co-authors. but all the co-authors will receive a copy of the referee reports directly from the journal. And then the corresponding author should also be responsible for managing all these requirements across the author group and to ensure that the entire author group is fully aware of and in compliance with the best practices in the discipline of publication. And there are also many journals which require that the corresponding authors should indicate whether any authors on the earlier versions have been removed or any new authors have been added and why they have been removed and why they have been added. So that's very important. So this I had already shown you that what are the detrimental authorship practices, authorship misconducts like ghost authorship, where the author who has contributed does not want his name to be there, okay, because he knows that it could lead to a conflict of interest. Then there could be honorific authorships or guest authorships, where some people get the authorship just because they are in a position of power in that university or an institute or the organization. And then orphan authorships, where authors who should have been truly listed as authors do not find their name in the authorship list. And finally, what is called a forged authorship, where people were not even aware of this work suddenly find that their names have been included as authors. And there are certain ways or solutions which are suggested by the journals in order to avoid these kind of misconducts. Then the authors must commit, and not only authors, the journals also must commit to the use of what is called as contributor roles taxonomy, or it is called as credit. So what is this credit? I'll let you know. And so the journal should commit to use and where appropriate extend this credit taxonomy as the best currently available method for embedding the author's contribution in the journal metadata. So I'll show you an example of this credit statement so that it will become very clear to you. This is the one. So this is a sample credit author statement where it states that the first author is involved in the conceptualization of the problem, the methodology involved, and the software used. Then another author concerns data curation and writing the original draft preparation. Then another author concerns visualization and investigations. Then there's another person who's into supervision of the whole work. And there's another person who takes care of software and then validation. And finally, another person who does the writing, reviewing, and editing the manuscript. So by using this statement, it becomes clear which author is doing exactly what in this manuscript. So it is what it does. It gives you very clearly. It shows very clearly what are the roles of each author as far as this particular manuscript is concerned. Then very recently, again, journals require that all authors should adopt what is called the ORCID system or the ORCID IDs. And this is like an identifier, like, for example, a PAN card for income tax, which any one of you, mostly all of you might have, or an Aadhaar card, for example. It identifies who you are. So this is like something similar to that, and it identifies the authors. So this is called an open researcher and contributor ID. So ORCID ID. So this links all the publications with a particular author, and it can give at a glance all the publications which have been published under this particular name. So now mostly all journals, they insist or require that the authors must have an ORCID ID, and then they should include this ORCID ID in the metadata. What do you mean by metadata? All this extra information, statistical information which concerns the authors and the manuscript, which is given either at the end of the manuscript or sometimes along with the names of the authors. So this is one example of an ORCID ID. You can see that some authors have a green dot against their name. So it's called the ORCID ID. So when you click on that ID, it shows your ORCID number, ID number, And if you enter this number in the ORCID site, you can see the entire history of that particular author. So this is what the credit taxonomy fully looks like. So there are different heads like conceptualization, methodology, etc., writing, original draft, review and editing, visualization, supervision, and this gives what it means. So conceptualization means ideas, formulation, or evaluation of the overarching research goals and aims. Methodology, how the whole research work should be taken care of and how one should proceed with the methodology of research. Then software, many manuscripts involve use of software. So this concerns the development of software or designing of programs, computer programs, and codes, etc., and which support the research in that involved in that manuscript. So like that, there are many other heads which have their meaning, and this is given under what is called the credit taxonomy, and this can be found in any publications, etc. And one can find the entire table, several versions of this table on the internet. So, so this is one such authorship contribution statement here. So we have a set of authors here, and they are identified by their initials. So you have here SG and DB conceived the idea and designed the experiments. SG prepared the samples and characterized them. Then SG and DB wrote proposals and carried out experiments at different facilities. Then BG carried out the X-ray diffraction experiments. Then these people, SDK, VS, PSI, carried out powder neutron diffraction experiment. So the role of all these authors is clearly identified in this, what is called the authorship contribution or the credit taxonomy. And you see the last line also, all the authors discussed and contributed in writing the paper. Okay. So the author's responsibilities are clearly spelled out in this statement. Okay, now we will quickly go through certain authorship misconduct cases. And believe me, you may not have imagined that these kind of issues will come up as far as authorship or author lists are concerned. And sometimes these disputes appear totally out of the world. And so we'll start going into these cases. So here there was one author who was affiliated with some institution R. He published 2 papers as a single author, okay? And one of them in the journal of some publisher A. And what happened after it was published, the publisher A was contacted by the research integrity officer of this particular institution R, where this author was affiliated, with a letter of concern which stated that the research institution has conducted a formal investigation and concluded that the author failed to acknowledge fully the likely contributions made by other staff and students in his research group, even though his work was heavily influenced by ideas and experimental results of other members of staff in the research group. So this is a very damning statement coming from the institution itself. And they said the formal investigation panel unanimously agreed that the author had behaved unprofessionally and upheld the finding that research misconduct had taken place regarding the submission and subsequent publication of a single author paper in the journal. So now what happened, the research institute said that they had not been able to reach an agreement with the author about the situation and asked the publisher to publish an erratum suggested by them. And the journal contacted the author, but the author fellow, he did not agree to this erratum. And he himself proposed another counter erratum, which the institute found unacceptable. So now what should be the path ahead? So what happened was the Koch forum agreed that the institution needs to resolve the issues with the authors. The editors cannot adjudicate in this kind of authorship problem situation, but they can ensure the publication record is up to date and correct. So the forum advised the publishing of an expression of concern until a consensus is reached by the institution and the authors. And in this expression of concern, the editor can describe the findings of the institution, objection from the authors, etc. And the authorship and contribution disputes cannot be resolved by editors and should be directed to the institution. Or another option is to threaten the retraction of this article if no agreement is reached between the single author, other authors, and the institution. And the editor can also give these people a time limit after which they will threaten that the journal will retract the article. So the journal followed these recommendations and wrote to the author announcing the decision to publish an editorial expression of concern. Okay. So then, of course, with this threat, everything got set right. The author responded promptly, saying that he has contacted his former institution and he agreed to publish the erratum which has been worded by the institution. And that erratum has now been published, and then the journal feels that the resolution is the best outcome possible. So you see, for example, this can also happen in a different way also. Here, the author could also be innocent, but sometimes the institution can be vindictive. Here, this was a case where the author was at fault and the institution was trying to resolve a problem. But the reverse can also happen, where sometimes, where the author is in the clear, but then the institution, for some reason or other, wants to put down the author, or for some reason, and they will try to be vindictive and try to create problems for the author. This also keeps happening quite often. Okay, the second case involves a journal which received a request for multiple changes to the authorship list after the manuscript was accepted. Originally, there were 5 co-authors, but after acceptance, the journal received following requests from author A, the corresponding author, and the co-first author. And what was the request? Remove one of the co-authors, some author D, and add a new co-author, some author E, and reorder the list of authors and change the designated co-first authors. So this is something which is just not possible to do these days. Probably this was a request which was sent a few years ago, but now it is just not possible, because to make any change in the author list after it was submitted itself, as I said earlier, it requires the consent of all the authors, very clear consent. But here in this case, what happened was the publisher explained that before processing any authorship changes after an article is accepted, the consent of all co-authors is required. But then what happened? All authors except that person D, whose name was to be removed, they responded promptly. But the response from author D was somewhat suspicious. It was from an unfamiliar email address, not the one provided at the time of submission, and the text matched verbatim the response from the first author, that is A. So this was again a very peculiar situation. And the publisher quickly replied to author D, asking if they could reiterate their consent to the proposed changes, preferably via an institution address. Okay, that means they asked that author D, are you okay with these changes? And you please reply using your institutional email address. Author D never responded, even after sending a follow-up message. So what was going wrong? The author A insisted on the changes, but eventually said to avoid further delays, publisher could proceed with the publication using the current author list. And the article was published. But after publication, again the author A contacted the publisher, claiming that there has been misunderstanding and they still wanted at least an author E to be added. Then the publisher simply reminded the author A, saying that the consent was from that author D is still outstanding and he has not replied. Then again author A supposedly chased the author D, and suddenly publisher received a new email stating that they agreed to be removed as co-authors. But again, this email was even more suspicious, because there was a third non-institution email address which was introduced, and spelling of the author's name was also wrong. It was not coinciding with the initial spelling. So all these suspicions were, all these problems were there, and then that aroused the editor's suspicion like anything. And then the actual suspicion of the publisher was that the corresponding author actually forged both of these responses from that author D. Okay. So then there was another case where after submission of the manuscript, one of the authors was indicated as the corresponding author. Now, during the entire process of submission, review, revision, everything, the corresponding author was responding to all the emails, and he signed the publication agreements also. And then suddenly the authors did not mention a possible change of the corresponding author. The manuscript was published online, and you know what do you mean by manuscript being published online? That means before it appears in print these days, the manuscripts are published directly on the website of the journal. Okay, so that's what is meant by online article. So 5 months after the paper was published, the authors of the manuscript asked the journal to change the corresponding author. But then they have not provided any clear explanation. Okay? So that's also a problem. So the journal sent an email to all the authors and asked why this corresponding author needs to be changed. And only one author replied, okay, the same person who wanted initially to change the corresponding author. Okay. And in that particular author's response, he said that during the submission process, they had indicated the corresponding author should be some other person from the list of co-authors. But then that was just a statement in the air because the journal could not find any such statement made by the group of authors. And then they started saying they did not notice that the corresponding author was incorrect, and that's why they contacted all these things. So it was all very confusing. Apparently, there was some problem going on with the group of authors, and somebody wanted that corresponding author to be changed to some other person. Okay. And this can happen, especially if the corresponding author is not the overall director or overall boss of the laboratory, then these problems can arise. So the editorial board simply decided not to change the corresponding author. And in this case, the manuscript was submitted to a journal, and after review and revision, the manuscript was accepted for publication. Then during this revision process, the corresponding author was in contact with the journal. He answered all the emails, performed revisions on the manuscript, prepared answers to the comments, etc. But after it was accepted for publication, the corresponding author was asked to review the final revision of the manuscript. Then suddenly this corresponding author stopped answering all the emails. So this is a peculiar situation. The person who was corresponding all through, suddenly at the final step, he stops corresponding. Okay. The journal tried to contact this corresponding author several times. They also tried to contact the co-authors and the university itself, but no response has been received. So here is the situation where the manuscript is hanging, ready for getting published, but the journal is not able to contact the authors of the manuscript. What will they do? Then the Coke Forum advised, don't publish this paper if the editor does not have the final consent from the authors. And the main reason would be that for not publishing the article would be that suppose you publish it, and if there are some issues which can arise after the publication, say like someone writes a comment on the publication, then you need to contact the authors again, and then you find a situation where the authors don't respond. Okay, so and authors may even have to give the data, and if they cannot be contacted, so what will you do? Okay, so that means basically nobody is taking responsibility for the work, so the paper cannot be published. Okay, so since the journal received no response from the author, they decided to withdraw the manuscript. Then there was another strange situation where the author submitted a manuscript and stating that he was the sole author. And the manuscript received a very nice review and everything. It was accepted for publication, and it was published also. But after it was published, some co-author told the author to contact the journal and correct the author list. So this author of record, I mean, that means the single author on whose name the paper was published, he did this and supplied the co-author names to the journal. Then the editor worked with the author group to determine the source of error and to resolve the list and order of the authors. And this original author, he acknowledged that he should have credited additional authors, and all authors agreed with the corrected list, but the original author insisted on being the first author, which the other authors did not agree. So as I said, typically all disputes arise with the order of the author list, who should be the first author and who should be the corresponding author. So as per the guidelines given by COPE, the editor contacted the university or the institution of that original author for assistance, and they found that the author has actually left that institute and he has gone to another country. And the university was in no position to help the editors to resolve the authorship issue. And then the original author contacted the journal and stated that there was a disagreement on the order of the authorship, and he was requesting a retraction of the article. But then again, the editor made one more attempt and then tried to resolve the dispute, but the original author refused to acknowledge any other author as the first author. And but at least he agreed that following the retraction, the manuscript could be resubmitted with another lead author. Then there was more attempts to negotiate a solution and then find out what is the problem, but they could not succeed. Then the COPE forum agreed that the editor had followed the correct route in handling this case, and it is not the role of the publishers or editors to resolve these kind of authorship disputes. So finally, the journal chose to republish the article with the correct author list and a corrigendum. And this has been now published online, and it will later appear in a print issue. Then we come to another case where the review process for a manuscript, during the review process, one of the referees, he alerted the editor saying that the manuscript appeared to be work of some collaborator X who was not listed as an author in the paper. And it became clear that the manuscript's corresponding author, some Y, with some affiliation A, was actually a postdoctoral researcher who was supervised by this person X, who was previously at this place A and recently moved to some other place B. And also a third researcher was an author on the manuscript and at an institution in a different country. So they asked this person X, who was supposed to be the supervisor, whether he was aware of the manuscript from the postdoctoral researcher, who was one Mr. Y. So X said he was not aware, and he stated that this particular person Y was funded solely by his own X's grant, and they were working on a similar manuscript for submission elsewhere. And he also requested that the journal should withdraw the paper. Then, of course, the journal asked Y to confirm whether the author list on the paper was complete and to provide all the funding details. But then this guy smartly replies saying that there were no other authors and this work was completely self-funded. So he probably lied here. Okay, we don't know. So then the editor again approached the forum, and then the journal saying that the journal had contacted the author's institution, and it seems that the supervisor is in the process of moving to a new institution, but is still at the same institution as the first author. And the department head said that he will look into the matter. And then the journal told this person Y that they have contacted the institution, and then that Y simply said that you please withdraw the paper. Okay. So then, of course, the journal withdrew the paper, but then they informed the institution and the advisor know that the paper has been withdrawn. And the institution is also continuing their investigation into this case. So what has happened, as Dr. X stated, they were working on a similar manuscript for submission elsewhere. The withdrawal of the article seems a reasonable response by the journal. The paper was withdrawn. and the editor contacted the institution and said that they are conducting their own investigation. So see, these, you can see in all these processes, how much of the time and effort and money is wasted in following and running after these cases. Then we come to another single blind peer review process. I told you what is a single blind review. That means as authors, you submit a manuscript, and the manuscript along with the author names is sent to a referee or a reviewer. And while the author gets the reviewer's comments, the author will not know the name of the reviewer. That is kept as a secret from the author. That is called a single blind process. And in a double blind process, both the author's names are not known to the referee, and the referee names are also not known to the author. So that's called a double blind process. So this was a single blind process where the reviewer gave the author a detailed suggestion about improvements in some analysis. And the author was asked to revise and resubmit the paper to address these points and other reviewer suggestions. And surprisingly, the author, of course, was not aware of the reviewer's identity, but he happened to run into the same person at some conference. And so he discussed this manuscript with that person, unknowingly that he was the actual referee. And during this conversation, at least the reviewer was a bit honest, and he did not pretend, and he disclosed that he was one of the reviewers of that manuscript to the author. Then, of course, the author and reviewer discussed how to improve the manuscript and all those things. But then what happened was the reviewer, though he should not have actually disclosed his name to the author, in this particular situation, he felt that it was okay. At the same time, he informed editors that, look, I have disclosed my identity to the author and I have discussed the results with the author. So he made this known to the editors. So the editors had to take a decision, okay? And then it was found that the manuscript was good, and it was felt that it was not good to reject the paper just because of an inadvertent interaction between the researcher and the reviewer. And in principle, actually, if the reviewer had contacted the journal beforehand, he could have recused himself from referring that manuscript. But he didn't do that. But what the editors did was they invited an independent reviewer to review the paper. And the editors wrote back to the authors to offer the opportunity to resubmit with the involved reviewer as a co-author now, after which it would receive a new independent review. But while all this was going on, the authors decided to send the manuscript to some other journal. So again, you see that the whole time and effort was wasted here. Then another case where the journal was contacted with a claim to the first authorship of a already published paper. That means somebody contacted the editor saying that the author's list is wrong and I should have been the first author. So this was online. So then immediately the print publication was put on hold, okay, because the journal wanted to investigate the problem. And what was the claim of the person for the first authorship? It was the person said that most of the results which were published in the paper were obtained during that person's PhD studies under the supervision of the corresponding author. And also that he or she has contributed to the writing of the text. And the claimant, the person who put this claim, he provided evidence in form of some screenshots of a submission confirmation email, subsequent rejection email from another journal, etc., and all those things. The PhD thesis, and all those data I provided. But there was some vital information which actually that person has not provided. We'll see what it was. The corresponding author was contacted, and then he declared on behalf of all authors the claimant had not contributed to the experiments or writing, and none of the results shown in the article were actually performed by the claimant. And they explained that this particular claimant was actually discharged from the PhD program. What do you mean by that? That means probably was rusticated or his registration was cancelled for some reason before it could be successfully completed. So now you can see, I remember the first few lectures I had given you, if you happen to indulge in some misconduct like plagiarism, etc., if it is very severe, then your registration itself can be cancelled. If that such a thing happens, you lose all your rights on your work also to the institution. So, so then of course the claimant still wanted to argue and dispute this, and then the institution was asked to investigate. Then what happened? The institution informed the journal that the knowledge generated during any state-funded project was the property of the institution, not the claimant or the person who does it or the student who does it. And only the institution has the ability to agree to a copyright transfer in agreement with the corresponding author. And that the corresponding author had full legal and institutional support to determine the author list of papers resulting from the project. And they stated that a graduate student may or may not be included as an author deriving from projects to which they have contributed. And according to the institution guidelines, in order to be included as an author, the student must successfully first complete their studies within a defined time frame. And then the institution did not, of course, comment on the extent of contribution of that person to the results and discussion presented in the published paper. So again, from as per the COPE advice, the journal approached the highest authority in that university to specifically confirm the authorship of the paper, whether it was determined as per the authorship guidelines. And they said, yes, it was all done as per the rules, and then no further action was taken. So these problems can occur. Please bear in mind that in case anyone's registration gets cancelled, then you will not have any rights on the data which are collected during the time you spent at the institution. And in this case, some Dr. X started her postdoctoral training under some fellowship. She worked on the project for some time. When the fellowship ended, she did all the work herself, gave to some seminars, showed her results, progress with a very positive feedback. And she also consulted whenever necessary the supervisor and with the senior scientist in the laboratory. And by the time she finished, she had written a manuscript solely on her work, went through several editing rounds and revisions with the senior scientists, etc. There were 5 co-authors. And so that means this person X, then the supervisor, some senior scientist, and the student. And the manuscript was sent to the supervisor, who had some remarks and received the final version with the understanding that he will submit it. But then the person next never received any reply, and she needs to know whether the paper was published, because that mattered to her tenure track or her employment. And but suddenly no information was coming from this supervisor. So then the forum concluded that this person next should submit the paper for publication, and when she submits the paper for the journal, she should be transparent about the provenance of the paper. So what do you mean by provenance? So provenance is basically the entire history of that particular article. You can also have for example, provenance of some artifacts which you find in some excavation. So provenance means you get to know the entire history behind that particular article. So here it's a question of provenance of the paper, explaining all the history. And then supervisor's contribution and all the conflicts of interest, they must be documented in the paper. And then, of course, if the paper gets published, the editor can consider having a statement concerning all this provenance and then publish the paper. Then the researcher tried to determine the correct person to contact who's senior to the supervisor, but then she could not do that. And then another case, finally, you can see that there was a paper which was published, but now it was under investigation by the host institution itself for misconduct. See, all authors signed that they agreed authorship and took responsibility for the content of the paper. And after the investigation started, one author, he asked to be removed from the authorship for some reason. Okay. But then now should journal permit that author to withdraw his name? Okay. So when the author initially has agreed and given an agreement saying that he is responsible, now why he should revoke that responsibility? So there was an issue here. And again, the COPE forum was contacted, and then they decided that the best course of action is to postpone any decision until an investigation is done. Then, of course, the journal can consider publishing an expression of concern stating that some investigation on this paper is being conducted, and then the journal should await the outcome of this investigation before making any changes to the paper. And one has to check, of course, whether all the authors are from the same institution. Okay. The particular author may have some legitimate reason for wanting to be removed if he is from some different institution. So the suggestion was to ask the author why he wishes to be removed from the article. And then it was confirmed that the author originally signed an agreement in good faith and signature was genuine, and so he has consented to the publication. Okay. So the author actually signed the agreement and then also consented. So if the editor decides not to allow the removal author following investigation, he could give the dissenting author the option of publishing a comment on the published paper. So they are all very complex issues whenever you think about these authorship issues. And all these authorship issues, they arise from basic human fallacies. You have number one, ego, number two, greed, self-greed. Then another thing is pressures from others or conflicts of interest, and disputes with your collaborators and things like that. So they are all basically issues based on human factors. So most of the authors, they are not usually technical in nature. They are mostly related to human reasons. Okay, so now we come to another section which is called complaints and appeals. Okay, now what are these complaints and appeals? Usually these complaints and appeals start usually from the reviewing process. So these complaints may arise either from conduct of editors and sometimes peer reviewers. And what could be these problems? Breaches of confidentiality, undisclosed conflict of interest, or misuse of privileged information. So how could these things, I had already discussed these things earlier. Sometimes the editors may not like the author's institution or like in simple words, sometimes these people can be discriminatory also. They may be discriminatory towards third world countries. Okay, editors in the Western world, they may be discriminatory, some of them. Okay, we don't know. And undisclosed conflict of interest. Reviewers themselves may be working in same areas of research. They may want their own research to be published first. So all these issues can give rise to complaints. And sometimes when a paper is retracted by the journal, that also can give rise to complaints. And then there could be some irregularities in the editorial processes, or that the journal staff are not responding to certain queries from the authors. So all these things can give rise to complaints. So the journals must actually develop very, very strong guidelines for responding to all these suspected ethical breaches. So let's see how these things go on. What could be the causes for complaints? Peer review by external referees with proper expertise is the most common method to ensure that the manuscript is proper and well qualified. But sometimes, the editors and the associate editors, they can actually reject manuscripts even without a peer review, as I said, in the screening process itself, because they feel that that particular manuscript may not serve that journal ideas and journal's guidelines or journal's outlook properly. So they may reject it in the screening stage itself without even sending it for peer review. Naturally, the author will get wild, saying that how could you not send my paper for review? So usually the reasons given is that the manuscript is outside the scope of the journal, or it does not meet the journal's quality standards, or probably it's of limited scientific merit as far as that particular journal is concerned, or simply that it lacks originality or novel information. And as I said, many people, authors from third world countries face these issues, and they feel very aggrieved that the manuscripts have not been given a chance to be sent to an expert for review. And some non-expert in the editor office might have decided, looking at some other factors, thereby missing the significance of the scientific merit. So this is quite common, in fact. So what should be the journals doing here? They should actually designate a contact person for ethical inquiries, appeals, and complaints. And these editorial officers should also focus on promptly correcting the literature, but request the authors' institutions or employers and funding agencies to investigate and follow up on author misconduct and discipline. They should also have a process for author appeals against editorial decisions. And this process has to be very well documented and very transparent. That also I have mentioned earlier. And the journals must have processes to investigate and manage, editorial misconduct, reviewer misconduct, or sometimes even staff misconduct. And usually these are all undeclared conflict of interest. And if required, they should also be able to contact other journals or contact other institutions of all reviewers, editors, and authors, and seek independent and legal advice. Then, in spite of editors' best efforts to solicit, fair and unbiased reviews to evaluate these manuscripts, okay, and to make decisions which are in the best interest of the journal. See, the editor's job is to make sure the journal benefits more than anything else. Okay, so they should see that the decisions are in the best interest of the journal, its readers, and the authors may still want to challenge certain editorial decisions. So in such a situation, they must have a policy to address the complaint and help to resolve the issues. So it's not an easy job to explain to an author saying that your research is not good enough for publication in that particular journal. It's a very difficult thing to convey to an author. Okay, so the journals also should determine whether the decision was clearly explained to the author and whether it may have been based on some wrong or questionable information, for example, on an incorrect reading of the manuscript by the editorial staff, or simply a bad review from the reviewers. And the journal should reconsider rejected manuscript if the author can provide a good reason why the decision may have been wrong. That means if a particular paper has been rejected by the journal, but you as an author feel very strongly that what you have done is good, correct, and as per all the requirements of that particular journal, then you have a reason to, of course, rebut the editorial decision and ask for an adjudication. Okay, so that also is a possibility. Then many journals actually allow authors to write a rebuttal letter and explaining why their manuscript should be reevaluated. And they should also encourage resubmission of manuscripts that are potentially acceptable but may have been rejected because some major revision or some additional data could be required. Okay, so if this additional data is to be required, then of course they must explain to the author that look, the manuscript is potentially good, but then it is lacking in certain aspects, for example, some data or something like that. And if you can address this suitably, we can reconsider and reviewing the manuscript. So many of these journals have what is called a very specific complaint and appeal processes. And for different publishers, this has some differences also. So for example, if you take the publisher Springer, okay, here when you have a complaint about the scientific content, that means you are appealing against the rejection of manuscript. So the editor-in-chief considers the author's arguments, and then the reviewer reports, and then takes a decision whether this reject decision should stand, or some other independent opinion from some other reviewer would be considered, and whether this appeal can be considered itself. And then this author is informed on this decision with some explanation, if appropriate. Okay. And now the decisions on these appeals made by the editor-in-chief are final, and new submissions, they actually take priority over appeals. And then about processes, that is, for example, the review time. So here again, as I said, sometimes reviewers take inordinately long times. Nowadays, it's not so easy to do that. Every reviewer is given a very fixed time for reviewing. So here the editor-in-chief with the handling editor, wherever appropriate, and he will investigate the matter, and the author will be given some appropriate feedback, and this is provided to all the relevant stakeholders to improve the processes and procedures. Then the complaints about publication ethics, okay, that means the conduct of the author, conduct of the reviewer, etc. So here the editor-in-chief follows the guidelines published by COPE, and then they may ask the publisher via their in-house contact for advice on difficult or complicated cases. And the editor-in-chief decides on a course of action and provides feedback to the complainant. And if this complainant or the author remains dissatisfied with the handling of the complaint, actually he can submit the complaint to the COPE, that is Committee on Publication Ethics. So this is what Springer follows in its policies. Likewise, you have this APS journals, or American Physical Society journals. For example, all this set of physical review letters, they are all part of APS journals. So here, the authors can actually appeal a rejection of the paper by the editors. Again, as I said, in the screening process itself. So in this case, a formal appeal, the paper and all relevant information, including the identities of the referees, will be sent to a member of the editorial board of this APS, of that journal. And the board member will actually review the case on the existing record, and he may seek, if required, some additional expert opinions. And then he will present an advisory opinion to the editor, which will be again sent back to the authors and the referees, if required, with the board member's name. And authors may suggest those board members they feel are appropriate or not appropriate to conduct the review. Okay, because the author may feel aggrieved that some particular person is against his work, then he may state that. But of course, the editor again has to take his own decision here. Okay. And editor can also appoint some appropriate scientist to consider the paper under appeal as an ad hoc board member. So that means you basically appoint some adjudicator for the paper. And again, the author of a paper that has been rejected, subsequent to an editorial board review, may request their case to be reviewed by the editor-in-chief. So it can go that far. And of course, this request should be addressed to the editor of the journal, who will forward the entire file to the editor-in-chief, if appropriate. And of course, such an appeal must be based on the fairness of the procedures followed, and must not be just another request for another scientific review. So basically the questions which are to be answered are where the procedures followed appropriately and did the paper receive a fair hearing or not. And then the decision of the editor-in-chief is the final decision, whatever it is. So this is how appeals proceed, and probably I will stop at this point and then continue my lecture, the next lecture, that is the other tomorrow. So I would like to know if any one of you have any questions at this point of time. Any questions in the YouTube channel, if possible? Are there any questions? Or in the other channel? Most. There's no video link in Anuvidya. On her desk it was told today there is no class. Join late. Okay, there don't seem to be any questions today. Okay. No questions in the other channel also. Does the order of authors in preprints affect the process of changing the order during publication? No, the order of authors in preprints has no bearing on the order of authors presented for when the manuscript is sent for publication to a journal. Okay, so a preprint, as I said, like what you put in the archives, it is only a statement to the peer group saying that, look, we have conducted this research work and these are our findings. So it is, as far as that is concerned, your preprint archive is relevant. The number of authors or the author list or whatever has no connection with the order of authors and the order of the authors, which is actually sent for along with the manuscript for publication with journal. So that remains final. In fact, so it has no connection with the author list which is there in the preprint. I suppose that answers the question. Okay, so there don't seem to be any other questions. So thank you.